Hey guys, tonight we take a slow walk down a sun-baked path beside the Nile, where the air smells faintly of date syrup and wet straw. The wind is low, the reeds whisper, and somewhere nearby, a clay pot overflows with something foamy. Not quite soup, not quite water, definitely not wine. You pause, tilt your head, and catch sight of barefoot workers hunched over something bubbling. Ancient Egyptian beer. It's thick, it's warm, and if you sip it too fast, it'll taste like someone soaked a sponge in oatmeal and left it in the sun. But somehow, this is the drink that built the pyramids, paid laborers, and soothed gods. You're about to wander through the strange, sticky, rule-ridden world of ancient Egyptian beer brewing. And let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive a week on it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're already half asleep with your eyes squinting at the screen, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I always love to know. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge slowly along a baked earth path in Lower Egypt, somewhere around 2200 BCE. It's late morning, and your linen wrap clings to you in a way that screams dry heat. On your left, a row of scribes sit under a thatched awning, squinting at papyrus. On your right, smoke puffs from small kilns, where squat pots with wide mouths are being sterilized, or at least heated until the black soot peels off the bottoms. You hear rhythmic squishing ahead. Wet reeds rustle. A goat bleats. And then you spot them. The beer brewers. There's no factory, no assembly line. Just women and men in dusty garments hunched over vats, large baskets, and giant clay containers. Everyone's barefoot. Everyone's sun-kissed. You blink and realize many of the brewers are not full-time professionals. They're wives, daughters, retired workers, even some priests filling in between rituals. You spot someone adding mashed dates to a container and someone else furiously stirring a thick sludge with what looks like a paddle made from palm fronds. The first rule here? Use what you've got. And what they've got is leftover bread, sprouted barley, river water, and a whole lot of patience. You pass a child no older than 10 hauling a jug bigger than his head, half full of the yeast-rich sludge that will someday become beer. He spills a little and doesn't seem too fussed. There's an unspoken rhythm to this village, like everyone's tuning themselves to the flow of the Nile. And it's not just about hydration or celebration. Beer is survival. You overhear a brewer mumble something about a bad batch last week causing more than just stomach cramps, and you make a mental note to skip tasting today. Interestingly, this entire system runs without modern measurements. There are no thermometers, no timers. Everything is done by feel, by memory. A mother teaches her daughter that when the mash is as thick as a sleepy man's thoughts, it's time to move on. Is that a real unit? Unclear. You pass a woman with a pot balanced on her head, sweat dripping down her jaw, and she mutters a half-joke. If the beer doesn't bubble, the gods aren't listening. You chuckle quietly. It's hard to tell whether she's joking or quoting something sacred. Mainstream historians agree that the typical ancient Egyptian brew was made from a mixture of bread and barley mash, fermented in large open jars and often flavored with local herbs or fruits. But you'll also hear the occasional fringe theory, like the one you just caught from a young brewer saying his father swears by throwing in a pinch of river mud to anchor the flavor. That's not FDA approved, but you're not here to judge. As you continue your walk, the sun climbs. A clay tablet leans against a wall, half covered in soot and featuring a crude sketch. A stick figure vomiting beside a beer pot. Perhaps a warning. Perhaps an ancient meme. Historians still argue whether this kind of folk art reflected actual brewing rules or was more of a running joke. Either way, the message feels loud and clear. Don't mess with the fermentation schedule. You pause near a rectangular brick building, modest but slightly elevated above the others. A small sign above the doorway features a worn carving of the goddess Tenanit, often associated with beer and childbirth. Inside, an older man is singing softly as he measures crushed emmer grain with a wooden scoop. He greets you with a nod, as if your sudden presence in the Third Dynasty isn't strange at all. The smell inside is overwhelming. Fermented grain, yeast, warm clay, and a faint whiff of citrus, oddly calming. He gestures for you to peek into a large vessel where something frothy brews in the shade. Don't lean too close, he warns. The last apprentice passed out from the fumes. We buried him with a bottle of the good batch. You laugh nervously. Joke or truth? Hard to tell. As your eyes adjust, you notice detailed carvings along the inner wall, symbols marking brew dates, sacred days, even eclipse warnings. Timekeeping here is mystical, bound to the stars. Brewing, it seems, isn't just labor, it's ritual. Outside again, the air hits you, hot and dry like a ceramic oven. Your sandals crunch over baked reeds as you pass another group hauling baskets of spent grain. Some of it will go to animals, some to fertilizer, and some, strangely, to a woman you see shaping bricks with it. Yes, beer byproducts make everything from cow feed to building materials. Reduce, reuse, reincarnate. You reach the end of the brewing alley and find yourself at a quiet bend in the Nile, where half-empty jars rest in the shade. One of them hums softly. The wind, maybe, or a lingering carbonation. You sit, rest your legs, and watch a white ibis stalk the shore nearby. Life here moves slowly, deliberately, like a recipe passed down through centuries, or a story told at the edge of sleep. You shift your weight on the sun-warmed stone, the Nile lapping quietly at the shore, and behind you, the wet squelch of brewing continues. But today's batch doesn't begin with barley as you might expect. No, what you're watching now is something far stranger. The beer begins as bread. You step into the shaded workspace of two women, hands elbow-deep in dough, their fingernails dark with flour and residue. They're not baking a normal loaf. The dough is shaped like a fat cushion, speckled with sprouted grains, and halfway through the bake, it's pulled out of the oven, underdone on purpose. You lean closer and sniff. It's warm, yeasty, and smells like it hasn't decided whether to be bread or porridge. Welcome to the first odd rule of Egyptian beer making. Before you make beer, you make bread. Specifically, a kind of half-baked, super sour loaf made from emmer wheat or barley, baked just enough to keep its shape, but soft enough to fall apart in water. Not exactly appetizing, but then again, you've already committed to this time travel tour. One of the women tears open the loaf and tosses it into a large ceramic vat filled with warm water. The bread dissolves almost instantly, like something from a failed cooking show challenge. The resulting slop is stirred vigorously with a paddle, pale brown, dotted with grain husks, and vaguely reminiscent of school cafeteria gravy. Don't drink it yet. You might regret it. This odd bread-to-beer method has puzzled scholars for decades. Some suggest it made fermentation easier by jump-starting the sugar conversion. Others argue it was simply a clever way to recycle stale loaves. Historians still argue whether this was a brewing innovation or just a workaround for inconsistent grain quality. A cat weaves around your ankles. It sniffs the air, sneezes once, and slinks off toward the grain bins. You stay put, mesmerized by the rhythm of the stirring and the bubbles beginning to break the surface of the mash. A young apprentice beside you dips in a hand-carved ladle, pulls up some of the liquid, and slurps it without hesitation. "Not bad," he mutters. "It'll be better by tomorrow." You're not sure whether to be impressed or concerned. You glance around. No thermometers, no measuring cups. Everything is done by instinct. A woman tastes the mash and frowns. She nods to her partner, who reaches into a pouch at her belt and sprinkles in something greenish. Possibly herbs. Possibly powdered frog. Best not to ask. This entire process is built on tactile knowledge. The brewers taste, touch, and smell constantly. Your modern mind might long for control groups and sterilization. But here, flavor is fate, and each batch lives or dies on the brewer's senses. You help carry a pot of this bread soup to the next station, where the mixture will be left to sit and slowly ferment. The pot is heavy, and your arms ache by the time you set it down. "Now we wait," someone says, "and hope the flies are feeling generous." You chuckle until you realize that's not a joke. Because here's another quirk of this system. Fermentation is often aided, though never officially acknowledged, by wild yeast floating around the environment. Some of it, conveniently enough, carried by flies. You suddenly feel less enthusiastic about the next tasting session. Still, you can't deny the efficiency of it. The heat, the humidity, and the readiness of airborne microbes make the Nile Delta a prime location for natural fermentation. These people, without microscopes or Pasteur, figured out something that works. Roughly. And it's not just the brewers who are invested in this process. You overhear a man muttering about bad bread leading to weak beer, leading to angry overseers. This isn't just a beverage. It's currency. Workers expect beer as part of their daily wage. If the brew's off, tempers flare. That soft, bubbling mash, it's payroll in progress. You lean against a post, watching the pots quietly foam. A scribbled sign nearby lists upcoming batches. Most are labeled by flavor: sweet date, bitter herbs, plain barley, though you spot one reading experimental fig and honey. That one has a frowny face drawn next to it. Despite the simplicity, there's artistry here. Recipes are passed down from mother to daughter, often with as many metaphors as instructions. "Stir until the sound changes," one woman tells a young girl. "When it hums like the bees near acacia flowers." You try to imagine how that sounds. A fringe theory suggests some of these brewing techniques came from observing animal behavior, watching monkeys drink from fermented fruit puddles, or noting which grain bins mice swarmed after harvest. There's no written proof, but it does add a certain charm to the chaos. You notice a group preparing for the next bake, stacking clay molds, brushing ashes from the previous batch. One of the molds has a carving on the side, a crude joke, perhaps. It shows a man so bloated he's floating above a beer jar. Someone nearby chuckles. "The brewer's blessing," she says, patting her belly. "Good beer, good dreams." You feel it too. That slow, sleepy pull of the air thick with yeast and sun. It's hard not to drift here. Time has a syrupy pace, like the brew itself. You glance one more time at the half-dissolved bread, now shifting colors and foaming gently in the pot. You'd call it soup, but that would be generous. You'd call it beer, but we're not there yet. Still, you watch the brewers walk away from their pots with calm confidence, like they know the gods will do the rest. You follow the trail of wet footprints and the rising scent of fermentation through a narrow alley of clay walls. The buzz of insects thickens. The air is heavier now, less the dry bake of the morning sun, more the sour, swampy murk of something alive and brewing. You've entered the heart of fermentation, and it's not entirely under human control. You step into a shaded alcove where rows of ceramic pots sit half-submerged in sand pits, their wide mouths covered loosely with linen. A few are already bubbling over slightly, thin rivulets of foam trailing down their sides. You spot a brewer tapping one jar with a knuckle. It makes a hollow thump. She nods. "Good day," she murmurs. "The gods are generous." At first, you assume she means it figuratively, but then you see it. A young priest standing beside a pot, murmuring softly in a sing-song cadence. He's dressed in a short white robe, eyes closed, and holding a dried lotus stem over the bubbling brew. You can't quite make out the words, but you catch the names: Tenenet, Hathor, Bess. He dips the stem in the froth, lifts it, and flicks a few drops toward the ceiling. Some land on your arm. A spiritual sanitation process, maybe? Or just tradition. Either way, you're now partially blessed, or slightly sticky, possibly both. The truth is, ancient Egyptians didn't fully understand fermentation, but they absolutely respected it. They believed gods like Osiris and Tenenet oversaw the transformation, turning humble mash into sacred drink. You look around and realize that for all the mess and manual labor, this part of the process feels ritualistic, sacred even. The priest finishes his blessing and walks off. Moments later, two boys enter with baskets of herbs. One drops in a bundle of what smells like coriander and fenugreek. The other, something minty and sharp. You're told this is to guide the fermentation, a vague phrase that leaves plenty of room for interpretation, or improvisation. Here, you learn one of the strangest rules of all. Don't interfere too much. The brewers stir only once or twice a day, just enough to keep the mixture from settling too unevenly. Overmanaging the brew is considered unlucky, or worse, offensive. You see an older woman slap a boy's hand away as he reaches to stir a third time. "That's for impatient souls," she scolds. "You want beer, not vinegar." Historians still argue whether this hands-off style was superstition, necessity, or some clever form of microbial stewardship. Modern recreations suggest that limited stirring actually allows yeast colonies to stabilize naturally. But the Egyptians didn't know that. They just knew what worked and blamed anything else on the moods of the gods. You crouch beside a jar, squinting at the frothy surface. It moves. No, really, it moves. A fat fly lands on the linen cover, pokes its legs at a dark spot, and scuttles away, satisfied. That's not unusual here. In fact, brewers sometimes encourage insects, especially flies, to hover around the open fermentation jars. Not because they're hygienic, obviously, but because their legs and bodies carry wild yeast from one vat to the next. One brewer nearby tells you proudly, "The flies know which brew will live." You choose not to question him. At this point, you're gently coaxed toward a special jar near the back wall. It's covered with 2 layers of cloth, both damp and surrounded by dried lotus petals. "The festival batch," someone whispers. "Strongest of the season." You ask what makes it different. "More time," the brewer says. "More prayers, and more flies." You don't know whether to laugh or nod respectfully. You do both. As you settle on a worn bench beside the fermentation zone, a cat slinks in, catches a fly mid-air, and promptly curls up beside a pot. Everyone leaves it alone. The animals here are as entwined with the process as the people. There's a gentle balance to the chaos. Fermentation isn't something to be forced. It's something to be invited. That's not to say things always go smoothly. You hear murmurs about a sour batch from last week. Too much heat, too much haste. The pot exploded, literally. Left a scar on the side of a wall and a bruise on a brewer's pride. There's even a mark on the wall above it now. 3 dots in a triangle, like an upside-down face. You suspect it's a warning, or maybe just graffiti with historical flair. In the middle of the courtyard, someone taps a pot rhythmically with a reed. It's not part of the brewing, apparently, just tradition. A quiet way of keeping the spirit awake. Whether they mean the spirit of the brew or some unseen deity is unclear. Nobody questions it. As evening approaches, the light grows gold and syrupy. The scent of the bubbling beer thickens, mixing with the dusty smell of sand and sweat. The air vibrates with insects, the occasional clink of pottery, and the soft, low chant of another priest making rounds. You watch as someone pours a small ladle of the still fermenting brew into a shallow bowl. The liquid is cloudy, with flecks of grain and bubbles popping at the surface. It smells sharp, sweet, and oddly buttery. You raise the bowl to your lips. Pause. Then take a sip. The taste is, well, it's a journey. Warm, sour, and strangely chewy, like the ghost of a wheat biscuit floating in lemon juice. It's not delicious, but it's not bad either. More than anything, it tastes ancient. Someone sees your reaction and laughs softly. "Still alive," she says. "That's a good batch." You smile, lips tingling slightly from the yeast. Your stomach makes a noise that you choose to ignore. As the last rays of sun stretch across the courtyard, you feel a calm settle over the space. The flies, oddly, have vanished. The brewers sit beside their pots, resting their feet, watching the lids rise and fall with slow, frothy breaths. The fermentation will continue through the night, left to the hands of gods, flies, and time. You wake with a slight crick in your neck and the distinct feeling of having slept near something warm and fermenting. Around you, the brewing courtyard is already humming again. Pots are shifted, cloths are wrung, and brewers move with that same slow, purposeful grace as yesterday. But today, the mood is different. Less about process, more about product. Today is serving day. You watch as wide-mouthed jars are tipped forward, their contents ladled into shallow bowls or smaller jars for distribution. The liquid now is thicker than beer as you know it, closer to a thin porridge, cloudy and beige, flecked with bits of grain. It's not filtered, it's not carbonated, and there's certainly no frosty glass mug. Instead, it's slurped with reverence and maybe a bit of resignation. This stuff is everywhere. You follow a delivery boy, maybe 12 years old, balancing 2 large jugs on a pole across his shoulders. He walks them to a construction site just beyond the brewing alley, where a small team of men, dusty, sunburnt, and built like statues, are working on a low brick wall. He sets the jars down, and within seconds, they're dipped into with wooden ladles and slurped up like nectar. You're told each worker receives a beer ration 3 times a day. It's not just tradition, it's their wage. Beer is the literal currency of the laboring class. And these guys, they're drinking their paycheck 1 mouthful at a time. A foreman scratches something onto a scrap of ostrakhan, probably confirming the quantity, and makes a note about sour batch yesterday. That might explain the side eye he gives the jars. There are no direct refunds here, but complaints can add up. And when they do, tempers flare. A fringe theory among archaeologists even suggests that worker strikes over bad beer contributed to the first known labor protests in history. That's right. No foamy pint, no pyramid. And beer doesn't stop at laborers. As you wander through the residential district, if you can call a network of mud brick homes and shared courtyards a district, you pass mothers scooping spoonfuls of beer into bowls for their children. The drink is low in alcohol, high in calories, and full of nutrients. Or at least, the ancient version of nutrients. Think of it as ancient Egypt's answer to a protein shake. If your blender was made of clay and your recipe included swamp yeast. You wince a little watching a toddler, maybe 2 years old, chug the mixture straight from the bowl. He burps. Everyone cheers. In the wealthier part of town, things look a little different. The beer here is poured through woven reed strainers, served in painted jars, and sometimes flavored with honey or herbs to soften the sour edge. You're invited to a courtyard feast where a woman in linen robes sips hers delicately through a long straw. You recognize her by the amulets on her wrists. She's a priestess, maybe even a noble. Her beer has flecks of lavender. Yours, unfortunately, still has a small pebble in it. You casually remove the pebble and sip anyway. The range of beer quality is staggering. Lower-class citizens drink thick, chunky brews with lots of sediment, more chew than sip. Upper classes get lighter, smoother, filtered versions with flavor infusions and even occasional sweeteners. But everyone drinks it. Men, women, children, elderly, temple workers, artisans, even the pharaoh. Though his batch is likely aged longer and brewed in golden pots under the chants of 6 different deities. You ask someone nearby if beer is ever used for medicine. The answer is a confident yes. It cools the stomach, softens the mind, and cleanses the blood, says an older woman as she stirs in crushed herbs. Add garlic for fever, add mint for demons, add crocodile bone for luck. You decide to steer clear of that last one. Interestingly, one papyrus mentions a recipe combining beer with powdered donkey dung to treat constipation. Historians still argue whether this was meant to be swallowed or burned for smoke therapy. Either way, not a method you're eager to test firsthand. In the temples, beer takes on another layer of meaning. You watch an offering ceremony where bowls of beer are poured over altars to honor Hathor, the goddess of joy, music, and inebriation. The priest chants while attendants pour. The scent of sour grain mixes with incense. It's strangely peaceful, almost spa-like, if your spa featured warm alcohol and a lot of beetles. You learn that during the Festival of Drunkenness, sacred beer was used to reenact the myth of Sekhmet, the bloodthirsty lioness goddess who was only calmed when tricked into drinking red-dyed beer. The resulting divine hangover apparently saved humanity. You wonder if you're having a similar experience. Near the end of the day, you find yourself again by the Nile's edge. This time, an elderly man sits beside you with a jug in his lap. He pours you a bowl. "Good for the joints," he says, flexing a bony knuckle. You sip. It's not as bad as the earlier batch, slightly sweeter with a hint of cardamom, or possibly just river mint. You smile politely. He leans in. "Beer," he says, "is what keeps us standing when the sun tries to knock us down." You clink bowls, or rather, gently bump them. Ancient pottery isn't exactly durable. As the sun dips below the horizon, the day's last beer deliveries make their way toward night watchmen and temple guards. Even those on duty drink. It's expected. It's encouraged. And oddly, it seems to work, because in ancient Egypt, beer isn't a luxury. It's a foundation, a daily ritual, a paycheck, a medicine, a prayer, and, if we're being honest, a bit of a gamble with your digestive tract. The next morning greets you with the crisp scent of wet reeds, warm earth, and rules. Lots of them. Because while yesterday was about sipping and slurping, today is about the intricate and surprisingly bureaucratic system behind beer production. You walk slowly down a dusty lane toward a storage facility lined with rows of massive ceramic jars, some sealed with wax, others stamped with mud seals bearing the names of various officials. A scribe stands nearby, nose deep in a papyrus scroll, squinting at you like you might try to drink something you're not supposed to. Don't take it personally. In ancient Egypt, beer is state business. A young brewer rushes past, carefully balancing 2 jars stamped with the official insignia of the Temple of Ptah. He nods toward a wall painting nearby, a detailed scene of men measuring beer, noting entries on tablets, and, amusingly, one man being thwacked on the head with a ladle. You raise an eyebrow. "Too warm," says the brewer, smirking. "Didn't follow the batch temperature schedule." The problem, of course, is that they don't have temperature gauges. Everything is determined by instinct, seasonal habits, and a dizzying array of traditional metrics. One brewer tells you they know the correct fermentation warmth when the pot sweats like a worried farmer. Another insists the mash must smell like bread that's thinking of turning sour. Precision, as you might guess, is a relative term. Still, there's an underlying order to the chaos, and that order comes from the scribes. You spot several of them now, perched on stone stools, scratching out columns of symbols that track grain intake, fermentation dates, container transfers, and temple allotments. One of them catches your gaze and gives a weary smile. "Beer without records," he says, "is a festival with no dancers." Poetic, also deeply bureaucratic. Historians agree that beer production was tightly regulated, particularly during the Middle and New Kingdoms. The state, temples, and even private estates had quotas, inspection routines, and designated brewing days. Some scrolls describe penalties for misreported grain amounts or watered-down brews. And yes, enforcement could be strict. You peek over a scribe's shoulder. His latest entry involves a batch of sour barley beer, rejected by temple overseers, diverted to laborers with reduced ration. You imagine the disappointment on that crew's faces when the discount batch arrives. Probably not worth a revolt, but close. You follow another official into a storage room where jars are sorted by temple designation. Each one has a lump of dried clay stuck to the lid, stamped with an icon, an ibis, a falcon, a sun disk. These marks don't just show ownership, they ensure that the contents haven't been tampered with. Break the seal, break the rules. And it's not just the temples keeping track. Even wealthy households kept brewing logs. One fraying papyrus you glance at includes a note about increased flatulence from lentil batch, a reminder, perhaps, to avoid legume experimentation. You stifle a laugh. Science meets digestive consequence. Then there's the matter of measurement. Ancient Egyptians didn't use liters or gallons. They measured beer in hekat, a dry volume unit that equaled about 4.8 liters. Laborers might receive a daily ration of 2 to 4 hekat, depending on the job. Scribes, naturally, got more if they wrote favorable reports. That's not official policy, just strongly implied. A nearby brewer beckons you to a small table where 3 sample jars sit side by side. "Temple batch, home batch, royal batch," he says, pointing to each. You're allowed a sip of each one. The temple brew is earthy, herbal, and extremely bitter. You're told it's made this way to discourage casual drinking. Temple beer is for offerings, not picnics. The home batch is smoother, slightly sweet, and far more palatable. You nod approvingly. The royal batch. It's filtered, chilled with wet cloths, and smells faintly of hibiscus. You take a cautious sip and almost smile. It's actually good. The brewer shrugs. More grain, more time, more prayers. You wonder whether pharaohs ever truly understood how good they had it. You make your way to the end of the compound, where an older man is overseeing a scale. Nearby, small sacks of sprouted barley are being weighed against stone weights. This is quality control, checking whether grain shipments match what was declared. Any imbalance is cause for suspicion. "Too much missing," the man mutters, "and the grain was stolen. Too much extra, and someone's cheating the state." You watch as a brewer pulls aside a scribe and whispers. There's some haggling, a quiet agreement, a scribbled correction. You're witnessing what modern scholars would call an informal audit. You might call it a very polite bribe. Of course, some of these rules aren't just about money. They're about divine alignment. Certain days are more auspicious for brewing. Certain grains are more awake, as one priest explains. Brewing on the wrong moon phase might curse the batch, or worse, anger the gods. Historians still argue whether these spiritual brewing calendars had measurable effects or were simply ritual habits passed down through oral tradition. Some believe the solar calendar actually helped prevent spoilage in Egypt's unpredictable heat. Others think it was mostly a way to keep priests busy. You glance at a large stone tablet propped near the fermentation area. It features a long list of brewing commandments, some faded, others still visible. Do not stir on windless days. Never face the Nile when pouring first ladle. Speak the name of Tenenet before the first taste. Never drink alone. You're not sure which ones are official and which are personal superstition, but everyone treats them with quiet reverence. By midday, the temperature rises. The brewing stops. The jars are sealed. The scribes head to the shade, still scribbling. A few brewers nap beneath palm fronds, snoring gently beside their pots. You sit nearby, cooling off, reflecting on how complex this all is. A drink so unrefined in appearance, yet surrounded by more protocol than a modern laboratory. Sacred, taxable, taste-tested, and temple-blessed. Beer in ancient Egypt was never just a drink. It was a contract. You wake again to the sounds of laughter, clinking jars, and soft splashes of river water. Today, something unusual hangs in the air. Less the sour tang of barley mash and more the warmth of family. You follow the scent of sweet herbs and bread to a large courtyard where people are gathered in celebration. And they're all drinking beer. But this isn't your dusty brewing alley or temple courtyard. This is a household, wealthy by the looks of it, and the entire family, from toddlers to great-grandmothers, is partaking in the day's batch. You blink as a boy no older than 6 expertly pours a foamy scoop into his grandmother's bowl, then refills his own. Nobody bats an eye, because in ancient Egypt, beer wasn't age-restricted. It was life-restricted. If you were alive, you drank it. You move slowly through the courtyard, weaving between children in linen tunics and women gossiping under shade cloths. They drink from ceramic bowls, long-handled cups, even shells on occasion. The drink itself varies, some thick as gruel, others more watery and infused with herbs. The texture depends on your status. The quality? On your connections. A nearby nursemaid hands a squirming infant a cup, coaxing a few sips into the baby's mouth between lullabies. "For strength," she says, smiling. You look at the brew. It's practically soup, low alcohol, high in calories, and filled with remnants of mashed grain. Not exactly a cocktail, but certainly better than untreated Nile water. Historians often marvel at this. That beer was a dietary staple for every age and class. Even children consumed it daily. It was food, medicine, social glue. The alcohol content was typically mild, but not always. Certain batches, especially festival brews, packed a punch. You wander farther into town, where the mood shifts. These homes are humbler, plastered mud walls, cracked pots, faded murals, but the beer still flows. A father sits with his teenage daughter on an upturned basket, sharing a jar between them while mending a fishing net. He scoops a ladle for her, then one for himself. They sip in silence. "Best batch this month," he says quietly. "Not too sour." You nod politely. You're starting to distinguish the sourness levels, too. A surprising skill to gain in the past few days. At a nearby stall, a woman sells beer in small jars for workers passing through. You overhear a young man ask for Queen's Brew. She laughs and hands him something clearly not royal, judging by the sediment, but he doesn't seem to care. This brings you to another odd truth. The class divide even affected fermentation. Upper-class women, especially royal or priestly women, often brewed their own beer or oversaw its preparation. Theirs was filtered, infused with honey or dates, sometimes even clarified with egg white. A batch for a noblewoman might be so finely made that it barely resembled the thick stew served to workers. In fact, one fringe theory suggests that wealthy households used beer more for ritual or cosmetic purposes than for hydration. Beer face masks. Beer rinses for hair. Beer foot soaks. Possibly effective. Definitely smelly. You slip into a small side street and find yourself at a tiny shrine built into a wall. It's dedicated to Hathor, goddess of joy, fertility, and intoxication. Offerings sit in front: flowers, dried fruit, and a tiny cup of beer. You realize it's still warm. Someone placed it there recently. The scent of brewing lingers on the air. You peek around the corner and find a family-run brewing operation tucked into their back courtyard. No temple priests, no scribes, just 3 generations working side by side. A woman in her 30s stirs the mash. Her mother adjusts the shade cloth above the pots, and her teenage son grinds grain beside them. They sing softly. A working song, maybe. The beat matches the rhythm of their hands. You're invited to try a taste. It's cooler than expected, maybe because of the cloth cover. Slightly sweeter, too, flavored with dried figs and crushed herbs. You take a sip, then another. It's not just tolerable. It's good. They laugh at your surprise. "This one's for guests," the older woman says, winking. "The sour batch is for the in-laws." You're starting to get the humor around here. As you sit and chat, you notice something you hadn't seen before: the deliberate passing of brewing knowledge between women. The younger girl watches her mother closely, mimicking every motion. Brewing is a household tradition. No formal schools, no instruction manuals, just shared experience, passed down like bedtime stories or recipes for date cake. Historians still argue whether women dominated beer production in ancient Egypt by culture, necessity, or divine decree. Temples often credited goddesses like Tenenet and Hathor with inventing the drink, and many household scenes in tomb paintings show women brewing. Others argue that as the economy professionalized, men gradually took over larger-scale brewing, pushing women back into private production. You glance back at the family. No one's worried about debates or records. They're just trying not to burn the mash. Before you go, the teenage boy hands you a small painted jar. "For the road," he says shyly. You thank him and walk off, sipping slowly. The street quiets. The sun sinks lower. In the distance, music starts. Someone's preparing for a small festival. As you turn a corner, you pass a group of women relaxing beneath a shade tree, giggling over something. One raises her jar toward you. "To sweet beer and bitter gossip," she says. You raise your jar back. It's not just a drink. It's how families bond, how love is shared, how jokes land, and how memories ferment. Whether you're a royal sipping filtered hibiscus blend or a dusty farmer chewing your way through lunch in a bowl, beer finds you and wraps itself around your day like sunlight clinging to sandstone. You wake to the sound of drums. Not festival drums. These are slower, heavier, ceremonial. You rise from the shaded nook you found overnight and follow the pulsing rhythm toward a long column of figures dressed in linen robes, each carrying something. A pot, a bowl, a woven basket. You realize quickly, this is a funeral procession, and beer is coming along for the journey. You trail the procession discreetly, staying close to the side walls. The mourners march solemnly to a rectangular tomb at the edge of the settlement, its entrance flanked by painted depictions of feasts, music, and, of course, drinking. You don't need to squint to notice the beer jars in nearly every scene. Even in death, it seems, Egyptians didn't travel alone. They brought a six-pack. Once inside the tomb, several attendants set down jars of beer near the offering table. Each one carefully placed, a few sealed tightly, others left open. One man sprinkles a mix of spices into a bowl of the dark brew, murmuring the name of the deceased. The body, now resting in a carved stone niche, is surrounded not just by amulets and perfumes, but booze. The priests begin their chant, invoking Osiris, the god of the afterlife, and Tenenet, the goddess of beer. It's an odd pair until you think about it. One oversees your soul, the other makes sure the trip isn't too dry. You lean against a wall, staring at a mural showing the deceased sitting beside a banquet table loaded with food and drink. And not just any drink. The beer is drawn in great, frothy bowls, brimming over in excess. There are even tiny servants in the painting, rushing back and forth with refills. You smile. This is someone who knew their priorities. Historians agree that beer was an essential part of funerary rites, not just for the living to drink in memory, but for the dead to consume in the afterlife. Tomb texts describe eternal supplies of beer being offered in perpetuity, and jars discovered in burial chambers were often sealed tightly, with markings indicating type, strength, and even brewing date. One priest pours a bowl of beer and sets it before a statue of the deceased. He raises his arms and intones, "May you never thirst in the field of reeds." You look toward a small platform where women perform the kites of Isis, a mourning ritual involving song, keening, and rhythmic swaying. Between sobs and lyrics, they sip from small jars. Mourning, yes, but also toasting. Beer here is grief and comfort in equal measure. A fringe theory among Egyptologists suggests that the amount of beer buried with a person was a subtle marker of status. More than the jewelry, more than the coffin. A larger beer ration meant more visitors would come, more offerings would be made, and the dead would be better hosted in the afterlife. Some tombs contain dozens of jars, carefully labeled and stacked like vintage wine cellars. You take a moment to study one of the sealed pots. Its lid bears the sigil of a brewer's guild, a rare sight. "Master's batch," someone whispers. "Only the best for this one." The scent of barley and herbs lingers in the tomb as the ceremony ends. A young boy steps forward, guided by an elder, and places one final jar at the foot of the niche. "From his favorite daughter," the elder says softly. You follow the mourners as they exit the tomb. Outside, a small gathering of relatives sits under a cloth canopy, eating bread, dried fish, and, yes, passing around fresh beer. This is not a party, but it's not a wake either. It's something older, gentler, a continuation, a reminder that beer connects the living and the dead. You sit quietly at the edge of the gathering, accepting a small bowl. The taste is slightly floral, perhaps to honor the occasion. A woman beside you sighs. "He used to drink his with mint," she says. "Now we all do." She laughs softly. You do too. As the crowd thins, you wander toward another tomb, this one older, partially collapsed. Inside, faded images still cling to the walls. Brewers at work, jugs overflowing, servants delivering beer to the afterlife. One odd scene catches your eye. A woman laughing, her bowl spilled, her hand raised as if mid-toast. A rare moment of joy preserved in pigment and plaster. Historians still argue whether these scenes are symbolic or literal, whether the tombs show idealized life or real, messy memory. But you're inclined to believe they're a little of both. There's a warmth to these depictions, a sense that beer wasn't just ritual, it was personality. As the sun begins to set, you head back toward town. Along the way, you pass a group of older women sitting in a circle. One of them is holding a worn jar and telling a story. The others laugh. You catch the words, "Remember when he tried to brew during the eclipse?" The jar passes around. No one drinks too fast. They're remembering, savoring, offering. Because even now, long after the final sip, beer remains. In the tombs, in the stories, in the laughter that floats over the Nile like incense on warm air. The next day breaks soft and golden, and with it comes a low thrum of anticipation. You follow a trail of laughter and clinking clay into the village square, where something clearly not part of the daily brewing routine is underway. Banners flutter. Musicians tune simple reed flutes. Someone has hung flowers from a pillar using what might be bread dough as adhesive. You've arrived just in time for a beer festival, though calling it that might undersell the scale. This is part celebration, part religious rite, part exercise in communal overindulgence, and it's all centered around a drink that still occasionally smells like wet hay. You're quickly swept into the crowd. Vendors peddle clay mugs, scented with myrrh or painted with crude jokes. One shows a goat falling into a vat of beer, and the caption reads, "Still better than your last batch." You chuckle. The humor hasn't aged, but somehow it still lands. At the heart of it all stands a tall platform draped in linen with an enormous jar at the center. A brewer stands beside it with arms raised, her face painted gold. The crowd hushes. She pours a bowl of beer and tips it onto the ground, letting it sink into the thirsty earth. "For 10 in it," she calls. "And for those who brew in silence." A few solemn nods. Then chaos. Music bursts forth. People cheer. And the festival begins in earnest. You quickly realize this is more than a party. It's a sacred institution. The Festival of Drunkenness, known from temple records and inscriptions, was an annual event where worshippers honored Hathor, goddess of love, music, and alcohol. The myth goes that humanity once angered the gods so badly that Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of destruction, was sent to punish them. She nearly wiped everyone out until the gods tricked her into drinking red-dyed beer. She passed out, forgot her rage, and woke up as gentle Hathor, a literal hangover redemption arc. To honor that transformation, Egyptians gathered once a year to drink themselves into a stupor, ritually, reverently, and very, very earnestly. You're handed a bowl. It's filled to the brim with a frothy mixture that smells of dates and spice. You sip. It's far stronger than any brew you've tasted so far. Sweet up front, but with a murky kick at the end, like someone spiked your oatmeal. Next to you, a group of women link arms and begin to sway, singing in low tones. Their song is rhythmic, hypnotic, laced with repetition and pauses for laughter. A priest moves among them, sprinkling flower petals and murmuring prayers. At one corner of the square, a brewer's contest is underway. Each participant presents their batch, and a group of elders sits cross-legged, sipping and judging with furrowed brows and exaggerated smacks of the lips. One judge gags, dramatically spits the beer into a reed basket, and holds up a tablet that simply reads, "Try again." You wander past a stall selling beer-flavored sweets, small cakes soaked in fermented grain syrup, dusted with fig powder. They melt on your tongue like honeyed bread, with just enough sourness to keep things interesting. Nearby, a man attempts to juggle 3 small jars of beer while dancing. He succeeds. For about 10 seconds, one jar explodes on the cobblestones. Everyone cheers. Fringe historians have long debated the purpose of these festivals. Were they pure celebration or subtle public catharsis? A time when societal boundaries loosened and hierarchies softened under the warm haze of barley fog. Some believe that during these events, it wasn't uncommon for priests to loosen their robes and peasants to steal a seat beside them. For a day, maybe 2, everyone was just a worshiper with a jar and a slightly questionable sense of balance. You rest for a while in a shaded alcove, sipping slowly. A girl no older than 10 offers you a garland of flowers and a painted bowl. The bowl reads, "Beer makes you brave or foolish, depends on the batch." You keep the bowl. As night begins to fall, the square doesn't quiet. It glows. Oil lamps flicker against white linen walls, and the music grows more languid. Couples dance. Children nap beside sleeping dogs. Someone snores beside a vat of leftover beer. In one corner, a storyteller stands on a low stool, retelling the myth of Sekhmet and Hathor, arms raised in exaggerated pantomime. When he mimics the lion goddess licking the spilled beer from the ground, the crowd erupts in laughter. Another group, a little more serious, sits in a circle, whispering prayers and sharing small sips of an extra dark herbal brew. "To remember who we are before the beer speaks," one woman says, bowing her head. You think for a moment. Modern festivals celebrate with fireworks, confetti, loud music. But here, they celebrate with fermentation, with community, with a deep abiding belief that joy is sacred and beer is the divine middleman between heaven and the headache. You stay until late, soaking in the rhythm, the warmth, the sleepiness that beer brings when it's not pushing you to dance, but gently rocking you to rest. As you walk back toward your cot beneath the brewing hut, your steps are slow. Not because you're drunk, though a little buzzed wouldn't be a lie, but because you feel timeless. As if you've stepped through the same ritual performed for thousands of years. Because you have. In this moment, you understand the heart of ancient beer culture. It isn't just taste. It's transformation. From work to rest. From grief to memory. From gods to humans. And back again. You rise with the sun, though calling it rising might be generous. You're mostly being pried from the depths of a hazy, barley-induced slumber by the sound of pounding. Not in your head, thankfully, but in the courtyard just beyond your resting spot. There, under a broad cloth canopy, several men and women are working around something that, from a distance, looks like a small, orderly quarry. You step closer. It's not stone they're dealing with. It's grain. Mountains of it. Welcome to the grain economy, the pulsing heart of Egypt's beer machine. You've tasted the drink. You've met the brewers. But today, you're about to meet the real star of the show, Emmer Wheat. Not exactly the flashiest character in the story. It's coarse, hard to work with, and goes stale faster than a donkey joke. But Emmer is the reason ancient beer exists at all. You watch as a group of workers haul baskets of the grain from a storehouse and pour them onto a wide stone floor. Here, they begin the slow, methodical task of sorting, pounding, and soaking. It's hypnotic. One person pounds the grain with a stone pestle, another brushes away the husks, and a third inspects each batch for sprouting. "You don't want it too fresh," says one older woman, flicking a half-sprouted seed off her hand. "But if it's too dry, it bites back." You make a mental note not to anger the wheat. Historians agree that beer production consumed enormous amounts of grain. In fact, estimates suggest up to 40% of Egypt's grain reserves in certain regions went into beer, more than bread, more than animal feed. And the line between beer grain and bread grain was sometimes so blurred that it became a running joke. "Bake it or drink it?" someone asks, holding up a particularly lumpy piece of dough. "Depends who's hungry." You follow a young boy as he carries a freshly mixed grain mash toward a dark room filled with circular stone ovens, not for baking, but for creating what's known as beer bread. This isn't the kind you slather with honey. It's dense, undercooked, and full of wild yeast. A strange hybrid between a loaf and a starter sponge. The smell is somewhere between sourdough and regret. Still, this odd bread is crucial. Once baked just enough to firm up, it's crumbled back into water and allowed to ferment. It's the bridge between grain and beer. And here's where things get quirky. Not all beer bread is created equal. Some loaves are made with lentils for protein, others with dates for sugar. One particularly rogue batch includes ground acacia pods, supposedly to make the beer dreamier. Historians still argue whether that meant hallucinogenic or just more sleep-inducing. Either way, you make a note to try that one very cautiously. As you watch the process unfold, you begin to appreciate how this system is more than food production. It's logistics. It's math. It's a dusty symphony of labor and intuition. Every loaf baked, every jar filled, is connected to the Nile's flood cycle, to temple tax demands, to ration lists carved into limestone. Nothing happens in isolation. You step into a grain ledger room, cool, dim, and surprisingly orderly. Scrolls line the walls. Clay tablets are stacked in neat bundles. A scribe dips his reed into ink and traces another figure onto papyrus. You peek over his shoulder. "Beer delivery, 2 hakat, to temple workers," he says. "Late, because the donkey sat down halfway." There's no box to check for that, so he just draws a small donkey face in the margin. Despite all this organization, the actual value of beer varied wildly depending on location, season, and source. In times of abundance, it flowed freely. In drought years, it became liquid gold. One tablet even records a bride's dowry as including a half-dozen jars of barley beer as sweet as her laughter. Sort of. You pass by a brewer experimenting with a newer grain. Barley, not emmer. It's lighter, quicker to ferment, but prone to spoilage. He's adding carob pods to mellow it out. "The rich like barley," he mutters. "Less chewing." Turns out, chewiness is a point of contention in beer circles. Some drinkers preferred their beer thick enough to coat the tongue. Others strained it through cloth or long reeds using a sort of ancient filter straw. One mural even shows a nobleman reclining with 2 servants, one fanning him, the other holding his reed straw steady as he sips. Not a bad setup, honestly. You take a break beside a cool wall where someone hands you a freshly brewed bowl, gritty, slightly fizzy, and still warm. You sip. It tastes practical, not delicious, but dependable, like the smell of worn sandals or old scrolls. Suddenly, you hear a loud thud followed by groans. One of the delivery donkeys has tipped its load, 4 large jars, into the sand. Beer spills out in bubbly streams. The brewer dashes over, trying to salvage the rest. "That's a week's ration gone," he mutters. "Next time, I brew for the donkey too." The crowd chuckles. But it's not a joke. Some records suggest even animals received beer rations, albeit highly diluted ones. Workers fed beer to oxen and donkeys to fatten them or calm their nerves. Whether it worked is another scholarly debate. One you probably won't win against a grumpy mule. You end your day back in the granary, watching as the last sacks of grain are stacked high. The sun filters through narrow slits in the wall, painting golden shafts across dusty floors. A young girl sits nearby, nibbling on a crust of beer bread, humming a tune you vaguely recognize from the festival. This is beer before the jars, before the chants, before the buzz. This is where it begins. With dusty hands, stubborn grain, and quiet faith that something good will come from all this pounding and stirring. And somehow, it always does. The next morning begins in a hush, as if even the wind knows something sacred is about to unfold. You find yourself drawn to the edge of town, where a long path lined with sycamore trees leads to a cluster of limestone structures gleaming faintly in the early sun. Temples. And here, beer takes on its most divine role, not as food, not as fun, but as an offering. A bridge between mortals and gods. And, like most bridges in Egypt, It's built with mud brick, faith, and meticulous record-keeping. You step inside a temple courtyard, just as the morning offering procession begins. A row of priests in pristine white robes file past, carrying trays piled with bread, incense, fruit, and yes, beer. Each item is carefully arranged on reed mats before a low altar. A young priest gently sets down a sealed beer jar, bows, and murmurs something you can't quite catch. But you know the rhythm by now. It's a toast, a prayer, a contract between realms. The beer offered today isn't for drinking, it's for feeding the gods. In ancient Egyptian belief, deities required nourishment just like humans did, albeit more ethereal. They absorbed the essence of offerings, and the more lavish the gift, the more favor they were likely to show in return, especially from Hathor, Sekhmet, and Tenanit, the holy trinity of the fermenting arts. A priest explains it like this: beer warms the gods' tongues, makes them speak kindly. That's one way to phrase it. You follow the procession into the inner sanctum, where offerings are set before a golden statue of Hathor. Her cow horns gleam in the lamplight, and at her base sits a carved stone basin, filled with yesterday's beer, now dark and still. You're told it won't be removed until the next moon. Fermenting favors, the priest says, not entirely joking. Historians have long been fascinated by the ritual use of beer in temples. It wasn't just a side item. It was often the centerpiece of daily offerings, festivals, and oracles. Certain records even detail how priests would perform purification rituals after drinking beer, just in case they'd offended the gods by sipping what was meant to be purely symbolic. Fringe theories abound. Some suggest beer was used in temple trances, aiding priests in communing with the divine. Others think it served a more practical function, softening the rigidity of ritual through mild intoxication. Or, as one irreverent Egyptologist once wrote, even gods enjoy a buzz during long ceremonies. You step back into the courtyard and catch sight of something unexpected. Brewers within the temple complex itself. These aren't the dusty street brewers you've met before. These are temple-trained artisans, grinding, fermenting, and chanting softly as they work. Their batches follow strict divine recipes. The grains are measured by sacred numbers. The mash is stirred clockwise only. The jars are sealed with amulets pressed into the clay. Every motion is choreographed like a dance. Brewing, here, is not craft. It's liturgy. One priest brewer invites you to observe. He points to an inscription on the wall behind him. A brewing instruction carved in stone. It reads like a poem. Barley blessed by moonlight, water kissed by morning reeds, foam rising like Ra's breath. Pour, stir, offer. You're told this recipe is over 800 years old, still used, still revered, and not all offerings are purely sacred. Some temples used excess beer as payment for workers, musicians, or even actors hired to reenact religious myths. One scroll details an entire drunken play staged in honor of Sekhmet's transformation. The cast was paid in strong beer, and judging by the notes in the margin, some forgot their lines but not their dancing. You stroll to the back of the temple, where empty beer jars are being cleaned and dried. A young acolyte scrubs one and mutters, "Osiris spilled his again." A joke, clearly, but with enough beer involved, who knows? This quiet spot reveals something else, how offerings were recycled. After the gods had their share, essence only, thank you very much, the beer was sometimes redistributed to temple staff, but not always. Certain beers, especially those offered to volatile gods, were poured into canals, fed to sacred fish, or used in purification rites. You peek into a side chamber where several older priests are sitting cross-legged, drinking slowly. This beer isn't from today's offering. It's a blessing batch, brewed from a mix of grains harvested under special omens. They drink in silence. No jokes here. Just the soft sound of swallowing and a faint crackle from an oil lamp. You're told only certain people are allowed to taste this beer. It's believed to carry visions, or at least unusually vivid dreams. Once I saw Hathor dancing in my bread oven, says one priest. She was offbeat, but radiant. Historians still argue whether these visionary brews were deliberately psychoactive, or if that was just the side effect of long fasting, chanting, and, well, warm barley alcohol. But the belief remains. Beer connects the mundane to the mystical. As you leave the temple, a child runs past carrying a jar of beer. You stop him. "For Hathor?" you ask. He grins. "For my uncle. He thinks he's Hathor when he drinks enough." You watch him disappear into the dusty haze. In a world of sand and stone, beer flows like an undercurrent, softening rituals, sweetening prayers, making gods a little less distant. Each bowl lifted is a whisper to the heavens. "I remember you. Drink with me." And maybe, just maybe, they do. You awake to the sound of clinking metal and low, stern voices. This is no festival. Today, you're venturing into the realm of control. Taxes, inspections, quotas. That's right. Beer, humble and frothy though it may be, is not just the drink of gods and farmers. It's also a state asset. You follow a group of scribes through a narrow alley behind a brewery compound. Each one carries a reed pen, a sealed tablet, and the unmistakable look of someone who enjoys saying, "Actually, that's not permitted." One stops at the entrance and holds up a hand, sniffing the air like a bloodhound. "Over-fermented," he mutters. Welcome to an ancient Egyptian beer audit. The brewery owner looks nervous, and for good reason. While beer was as common as sandals in this society, it was also a taxable product, subject to state scrutiny, especially in temple estates and royal workshops. Every grain used, every jar filled, had to be logged, stamped, and verified. Misreport the volume? Expect a fine. Dilute the mix too far? Expect worse. One scribe taps on a sealed storage jar with a thin copper rod. It gives a solid clunk. He scratches something on his scroll, then opens the seal. The scent of yeasty barley wafts out, along with something faintly citrusy. He raises an eyebrow. "Orange peel?" The brewer shrugs. "A personal touch." The scribe makes a non-committal grunt and jots a note. "May require priest review." You wince. These scribes, like walking spreadsheets, weren't just being nosy. Their records ensured grain wasn't being siphoned for black market batches. And yes, that was a thing. Fringe batches, sometimes called ghost jars, were brewed in secret and sold off books. Smugglers, hustlers, even overachieving priests would stash a few jars here and there, either to avoid taxes or to spice up festivals without supervision. You pass a hidden corner where two men huddle over a poorly sealed jar. One glances your way, shoves a reed over the top, and nods politely. You've just stumbled into the underbelly of ancient Egyptian beer crime. Historians still debate how extensive these shadow operations were. Some argue they were rare and risky. Others believe most large estates had at least one creative brewer working both sides of the Nile. But even within legal bounds, beer was currency. Workers at pyramid sites, tombs, temples, and state projects were often paid in beer, rations carefully measured in hekat and recorded in lists more detailed than your average shopping receipt. One example from Deir el-Medina lists weekly wages in beer, bread, and onions. Miss a delivery, and workers didn't just go thirsty. They went on strike. Yes, the world's first recorded labor strike involved beer, not gold, not jewels. Beer. You're starting to understand why those audit scribes are taken so seriously. You move next into a grain inspection room. Here, state inspectors examine the quality of emmer before it even touches the mash. Crushed, weighed, sniffed. "Too dry," one says, tossing a handful onto the floor. "Keep that up, and your beer will ferment like a goat in a bathhouse." You politely choose not to imagine that. Then there's the matter of ration structuring. Temples and estates often maintained long lists showing exactly who received how much beer, when, and why. Priests got more on feast days. Sailors got stronger brews before Nile voyages. Laborers received daily rations calibrated to heat, workload, and, sometimes, who they knew in the kitchen. You find one list scratched into a limestone shard. 4 hekat, overseer. 3 hekat, carpenter. 2 hekat, scribe, bad attitude. 5 hekat, brewer, wedding week. You smile. Bureaucracy may be eternal, but it still has personality. A passing brewer invites you to see one final curiosity: a royal beer seal, a clay impression used to mark jars designated for Pharaoh's consumption. It's intricately carved, showing the king seated beneath a canopy, sipping from a long straw. You're told only 24 such seals exist in the entire region. You touch it, the brewer warns, and the gods will audit you. Noted. There's also an older system at play, one that historians are still trying to untangle. Some temple sites include references to beer watchers, officials who oversaw not just production, but behavior. Were they quality inspectors, moral enforcers, festival referees? The records aren't clear. But one entry suggests that a beer watcher once fined a priest for cheering too loudly after the second jar. You suspect that priest was just getting started. By late afternoon, the scribes pack up their scrolls. One gives the brewer a slow nod. "Acceptable," he says. The brewer exhales deeply, like he's just avoided being tossed into a vat. You stroll back through the compound, passing rows of sealed jars. Each one represents grain grown, hands worked, rules followed, or bent. For the ancient Egyptians, beer wasn't just an indulgence or a meal. It was a regulated, taxable, inspectable necessity. A liquid ledger. A frothy fine print. and behind every sip was a bureaucracy ensuring it made it from barley to bowl without vanishing into someone's private stash. As the sun dips low and the scent of warm grain fades into twilight, you reflect on the odd, almost magical balance ancient Egypt struck, a drink that was both daily and divine, sacred and suspicious, worshipped and watched. Even in paradise, someone checks the inventory. You wake to a sound that isn't quite music, but it's close. It's the rhythmic swish of grain being stirred, the gentle plop of liquid ladled into jars, the low murmur of voices retelling yesterday's stories with today's embellishments. Today is your last full day in the world of ancient Egyptian beer, and you're heading somewhere different. You follow a caravan out of town, merchants hauling carts, donkeys braying, children running ahead barefoot. The path leads toward the edge of Egypt, toward border markets and foreign lands, where cultures blend and new customs are born. Because beer didn't just live and die within Egypt's borders, it traveled, and it changed. At the first trading outpost, you see rows of foreign goods, cedar from Lebanon, lapis from the east, incense from Punt, and tucked between them, jars of beer. Some are unmistakably Egyptian, round-bellied with flared rims, but others are odd, taller, thinner, some painted with strange symbols, some sealed with wax instead of clay. You ask one trader what they're selling. "Beer for the Cushites," he says, thumping a jar. "They like it sweeter, less foam, more kick." Turns out, Egyptian beer was a major export, especially along the Nile corridor south into Nubia. And it didn't just stay Egyptian. Local brewers in foreign lands adapted recipes, blending Egyptian methods with regional flavors. Honey, fruits, wild herbs, even tree sap. You take a cautious sip of one offered sample and blink. It's like a fig had an argument with a mint leaf. Nearby, a group of laborers from a border fort are relaxing with bowls of beer. You sit among them. They swap stories, some in Egyptian, others in foreign dialects. But the gestures are universal. A shared bowl, a clap on the back, a toast to surviving another week. This is beer as diplomacy, as translation, as warmth between strangers. You listen to a soldier describe how a brewing method from Nubia changed the way he ferments at home. "Better bubbles," he says proudly. Historians still puzzle over how far Egyptian brewing knowledge spread. Some believe recipes made it into Mesopotamia, influencing their own beer traditions. Others argue that the traffic went both ways, that Egypt borrowed as much as it exported. You wander through the market and notice a fringe stall. A woman offers protective beer amulets, tiny clay charms shaped like jars, inscribed with symbols for health, fertility, and dreams. "Wear it by the vat," she says, "and the foam won't sour." You buy one. Later, you return to a riverside rest stop, a place where caravans break and ferrymen drink, and discover yet another twist in the beer story. Flavor innovation. Here, brewers compete not with volume, but with novelty. One offers sun beer, fermented using solar heat. Another boasts of a 3-spice brew that includes coriander, cinnamon, and... wait, is that garlic? One sip. Immediate regret. You recover with a more traditional bowl, this one filtered clean and flavored with carob. smooth, subtle, and possibly the best you've had. You thank the brewer, who bows and whispers, "The secret is patience," and singing. Apparently, the brewing songs vary by region, too. Some are fast and rhythmic, others soft and breathy, almost lullabies. A few claim specific melodies enhance fermentation. Whether that's chemistry or psychology is anyone's guess, but you hum one just in case. Night falls, and you climb a dune near the outpost to watch the stars emerge. In the distance, the Nile glimmers like spilled silver. The faint sound of laughter and clinking jars drifts up the hill. You think back, through the thick beer of workers, the smooth brews of temples, the festival toasts, the funerary offerings, the stern inspections. And now, here, at the border, beer has become something else entirely. A language. A way of saying hello, thank you, please don't stab me, and would you like to trade grain for lapis? You sip from a final jar, thin, herbal, slightly tart. It's not the best you've had, but it's different, and in its own way, perfect, because beer, like people, adapts. And as the wind cools and the stars settle into their patterns, you begin to understand. Beer wasn't just Egypt's drink. It was Egypt's idea of togetherness, alive, evolving, echoing across borders and centuries. You let that last sip linger, and now you're ready for sleep. And so, you settle back. The fire has burned low. The jars are empty. The songs have faded into quiet hums and slow breathing. You feel the grainy earth beneath your resting mat and the softness of linen draped over your shoulders. The warm air carries the scent of old barley, sun-baked clay, and distant river reeds. Your journey through ancient Egypt's beer-soaked corridors has ended, not with a final toast, but with the gentle silence that follows a long, satisfying story. You remember the hands stirring the mash, the children sipping their rations, the priests bowing over offerings, the women brewing in back courtyards, the laughter of drunk scribes who still had scrolls to fill in the morning. You recall the festivals, the dreams whispered into foam, the jars carried across borders in the hopes of something warmer, gentler, shared. Beer, for them, was nourishment, comfort, ritual, mischief, memory, a kind of gentle magic that lived in every jar and every mouth that lifted it. And now, even here, lying still with eyes closed and breath slowing, you carry it with you. Not the taste, not the buzz, but the humanness of it. The feeling that across thousands of years, someone once sat just like this, bowl in hand, dust in the air, starlight above. And they, too, felt full, felt safe, felt home. So breathe softly now. Let the night wrap around you like linen. And if you dream of warmth and quiet laughter, of flickering lamps and the faint scent of beer bread baking in the dark, that's just Egypt, still echoing, still with you, still pouring one last jar. Sweet dreams.